Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I am here today on the USS New Jersey. Museum ship today, berthed outside of Camden, New Jersey, open to the public, and equipped with what is basically the largest firearm ever employed by the US military. Those are three Mark 7 16-inch naval battleship guns, and we are going to go through today and take a look at the entire process of how they work. The gun itself is pretty simple. It's a single shot, recoiling, rotating breech gun mechanism. But what makes it really interesting, I think, is all of the logistics that are involved in actually making the thing fire. This fires a 2,700-pound, super heavy, armor-piercing shell. They did also have high-explosive shells, but the primary armament for anti-ship use is this American super heavy armor-piercing shell. Uses 660 pounds of powder per charge, and somehow you have to safely store that stuff and then get it up into the turret, into the gun breech to actually fire the thing. And of course we have the issue of how do you aim that, because you're not putting iron sights on the top of the turret. I'm here on the New Jersey thanks to the generosity of today's video sponsor, World of Warships. World of Warships is a free-to-play tactical naval combat game featuring hundreds of historically inspired warships from a wide variety of different nations. You can jump right into the action with your friends, explore naval heritage with vessels from submarines to battleships and aircraft carriers and everything else in between in the heat of fun teamwork-based battle. You have to plan and combine your own strength to defeat the enemy fleet in detailed maps inspired by real-world battlefields with awesome visuals, dynamic weather effects, and a whole lot more. And right now, the game is celebrating America's 250th anniversary, and they're marking the occasion with a special 250 US anniversary event running through July 15th. As you play matches, you'll unlock historical artwork and documentary videos that trace the story of American independence like a virtual museum, celebrating the spirit that changed this world. You'll also earn exclusive rewards and brand new ships, like the Tier 9 cruiser Fort Worth and the Tier 10 battleship Wisconsin. Joining in just a single battle right now will get you a free anniversary bundle in the Armory with custom paint jobs, visual effects, and more. As part of the America 250 celebration, they're offering new and returning players a massive care package containing 1 million in-game credits, 7 games of premium account time, 500 doubloons, Stars and Stripes camo, and 2 premium American ships, the cruiser USS Albany and the destroyer USS Smith. If you're a brand new player and you stick around for 10 battles, you can pick out another additional classic American warship like the South Carolina, the St. Louis, or the Wicks to keep permanently in your own armory. You can join right now by clicking the link in the description text and using the sign-up code USA250. And if you're not on a PC, no problem. World of Warships is also available on console via World of Warship Legends. So sign up with the link below today and get started. This whole ship is built around 3 of these turrets with 3 of these guns each, and it's a fantastic mechanism. So we're going to start by going all the way down into the bowels of the ship. We are currently 2 stories up above the waterline here. We're going to go like 6 stories down into the base of the turret and work our way up as the whole loading process goes through. However, before we start that, I want to talk briefly about the design and the intent of these guns, because the New Jersey is an Iowa-class battleship. She was commissioned in 1943 and would be the last and biggest of the United States battleships. And when she was designed, the idea was they wanted a bigger, better firepower platform than on the previous South Dakota-class battleships. However, at this time when she was being designed, when the Iowa class was being designed, the US was still a party to the London Naval Treaty that limited warship size. So there were weight restrictions on how big of a ship we could build. The US would have preferred to build essentially like a 4-turret battleship with 18-inch guns on it, probably, but that wasn't feasible under treaty limitations. So they end up with 3 turrets and a bit of a quandary as to what gun to use, because the ship ends up being just slightly too small to use the biggest available guns, which would have been the Mark II 50 caliber 16-inch. And just as a refresher for you guys, for artillery type weapons like this, caliber indicates the length of the barrel. So a 50 caliber gun in this case means the barrel length is 50 times the bore diameter. The bore diameter is 16 inches. which means we have a barrel length of something on the order of, what, 66 feet? I believe 68 feet long on the barrel. That's a 50 caliber 16-inch gun. The Army, or the Navy, had put 45 caliber 16-inch guns on the South Dakota class, the previous class of battleships. They wanted something bigger and better than that, but the available space for the turrets on this hull didn't allow them to use the bigger guns that were available. So they end up coming up with a hybrid gun design that essentially takes that 45 caliber gun from the South Dakota class. They add 5 calibers of barrel length to it, gives it a little bit more muzzle velocity, which gives it like 4,000 yards more effective range, and they can squeeze 3 of them into these turrets, and that's the setup that gets used. This ends up being a unique naval gun that is only used on the 4 Iowa-class battleships that are made, one of them being this, the New Jersey. So the design intent, the way these guns are built is a little bit different than other battleships of the time. So the British battleships used a 2,000-pound armor-piercing shell. The Japanese battleships at the time used a 2,250-pound shell. The US deliberately went for kind of the 45 ACP of battleship guns, slow and heavy. By having an extra heavy shell, 2,700 pounds, it's going to be moving a bit slower, but the idea is that it will generally be fired at a higher arc to get a long effective range, which means when it comes onto an enemy ship, it's going to be traveling not horizontally like we think of a bullet, but much more at a steep downward angle. It's extra heavy, gives it better armor penetrating capacity, and it's intended to go through the upper deck of a ship. You're not trying to shoot through the side armor of a battleship, you're trying to shoot through the decking where the armor is much weaker. Kind of the corollary to having an extra heavy armor-piercing shell means that, well, you've got less volume in the shell, less weight available for the actual explosive charge. The idea is the shell goes through the armor of the ship and then explodes inside. Well, there's less explosive in these American shells, but better capacity to get through the armor of an enemy ship. And the idea is it's better to make a hit and have a little bit less explosive than to have a more powerful shell that fails to penetrate through the enemy ship. How relevant that decision was is maybe a little questionable because, well, as we know in World War II, the American battleships didn't ever really get into decisive gunfights with enemy battleships. All right, so let's head down into the turret and start the process of how we actually fire these guys.
It takes 79 men to operate this turret and its 3 guns. Incidentally, this is a 3-gun turret, not a triple-gun turret. That means each gun can elevate independently of the others. The combined rate of fire is over 18 rounds a minute. The very bottom deck contains the powder handling room, completely surrounded by the magazines.
The most hazardous material on this ship is the powder storage for these 16-inch guns because there is so much explosive potential. It was, in fact, a powder magazine that destroyed the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. Safety precautions for this stuff are absolutely critical, and we see that built into the magazine. So I am down here in the very bottom of the ship, and we have, this is a full weight example. This is one of 6 powder bags that would be used for a single firing of a single 16-inch gun. This weighs 110 pounds of powder, and they come in canisters of 3 each. So these are all stored in magazines like this one. You can see we have these racking rails, which normally would be filled all the way up to the top with canisters of powder. Firing the gun requires 2 of these canisters worth of powder per shot. So this whole thing weighs 350 pounds when it's full, hence there's a hoist system here to actually move these things around. Once the gun is in firing condition, the crew is going to be opening these canisters, they're going to be pulling out the individual powder bags and putting them onto the loading tray. This particular magazine actually has 2 of these loading trays in it. This is one of the larger magazines. They kind of squeezed magazine space in everywhere they could fit it at the bottom end of the ship between the hull and the turret barbettes, the turret cylinders. So we got 2 in here. The other smaller magazines typically will only have 1 and will have a lot less powder in them individually. But worth pointing out, These trays are brass. Everything in here is designed to mitigate fire hazards. So these are some of the very few compartments in the ship that were actually air conditioned in its original design. Sailors didn't rate air conditioning, but powder magazines did. Radios, the other electronic gear on the ship was also air conditioned. And you can see right up there a radiator on a cold water pipe. That was the air conditioning system. This is also a compartment that has a significant sprinkler system built into it. It's not so much as a fire suppression sprinkler as it is to literally flood these compartments if there was some emergency that required it. Way better to lose all the powder in here than to have the entire ship explode. So once you've got powder bags on these trays, they are then going to go through passing scuttles. You can see this one is closed, that one is sort of open. There's like 3 separate layers of flash prevention. The idea is there is never an open connection between the turret barbette and this powder magazine, so that no matter what's happening in the turret, there will never be a spark that comes through and detonates the powder magazine. So the first level of protection is this solid shield. This is watertight. If you lock this down, that's something you can do to flood the compartment without worrying about any leakage into other compartments. So first thing we do is we open this up, and that's what we've got here. You can actually see they've got some curved tracks here. So this slides out and then up. Then we can roll each powder bag one at a time into this passing scuttle.
The scuttle operators take the powder bags from the magazine scuttles and hand them to the powder passers.
Now, this passing scuttle doesn't actually lead directly into the turret itself. Instead, there's about a 3-foot open dead space between the powder magazine over there and the turret barbette itself over here. And this acts as an extra layer of safety to again ensure that there is no chance of a spark being transmitted from the magazine, well, between the magazine and the turret proper. So we have this passing scuttle. I've got a crank handle here that allows me to rotate it 180 degrees. So now it's open on the magazine side. I will take this handle and signal to the powder handler on the other side that I am ready for powder. So I'm going to switch this to pass powder. When the man on the other side has rolled a bag of powder in, he's going to use his side handle here to signal to me that it's ready to come through. We get another nice loud bell. I can then crank this open. Powder bag rolls out onto this brass shelf, ready for me to transfer into the turret barbette. We have another identical passing system, so I can say I'm ready here. You can imagine the cacophony in these spaces when this gun was actually being fired. There are, well, 1, 2, there's a third powder magazine pass behind the camera there. These bells are going off constantly as each one of these powder passes has multiple men. Like there's a guy on that side, a guy here in the middle, and another guy on the inside constantly signaling back and forth as to what's going on, amongst all of the other racket of what's going on in here. So once the man on the inside is ready, he opens up the scuttle. Here, I roll the powder bag in, tell him it's good to go. Now, at last, we are inside the actual barbette of the turret. So you can see this opening in the decking down here. Inside that is the rotating part of the turret. So when the guns are aiming and firing, that part of the structure is moving. This part is connected to the hull and remains in place at all times. So I've got my powder scuttle here. We've moved powder through the interstitial space into the barbette itself. I crank the handle open. Bam. Out comes one bag of powder. I will now take this and move it into the elevator mechanism to hoist it up to the guns. Incidentally, all of these powder scuttles have associated immersion tanks. So this would be filled with water, salt water specifically. And when you are actually working the guns, tank's full, lid comes off. If you have a ruptured powder bag, something tears, there's any sort of problem with a powder bag, boom, into the immersion tank to render the powder safely inert. Remember that we are in a 3-gun turret, which means we have to elevate powder from way down here in the bottom of the ship up to 3 separate gun barrels. You can hear it echoing. This is one of the biggest open spaces in the ship. It's a really cool room. We'll give you some B-roll in this room. But this room feeds powder to 3 separate gun barrels, the whole turret, which means there are 3 of these elevators. We've got one right over there. We've got this one, and then we've got one on the other side of this superstructure. So left gun, center gun, right gun is over there. Again, structure here is made out of brass to make sure there's no possibility of sparking. We're going to load the powder bags, all 6 of them on here, and then this goes into an elevator mechanism on the inside. All 6 bags get rolled in, and the powder gets hoisted up as a 6-bag unit.
Unlike powder hoists for case guns, these operate more like an elevator, with a car that moves the powder up through the trunk by means of a cable.
All right, so that was the powder. Now we have to talk about the actual projectiles, the thing we're shooting. There were 2 primary types of projectile that the New Jersey and the other Iowa-class battleships had. Those are armor-piercing. We have a mock-up of one of those here, and high capacity. They didn't call these high explosive, they called them high capacity, and that's this guy. So you'll notice a height difference. The New Jersey fast battleships were able to fire a 6-foot tall shell. The earlier World War I era ships were limited to a 5-foot tall shell. So the high capacity round here is actually the same round that was designed for the early World War I era US battleships. And when they developed the new classes of fast battleships, they were like, it didn't make sense logistically to develop a new high capacity explosive shell because you weren't really going to get that much more effect out of it, and it was simpler just to maintain this existing style. So it's slightly shorter, 5 feet tall, about 2,000 pounds, and contains about 150 pounds of actual explosive in it. This guy can only be fired by the more modern fast battleships, like the New Jersey. It's the armor-piercing round, and what's cool about this dummy is we can actually take it apart, so I can show you the internal construction. This thing on the front is basically just your, if we think about this like hunting ammo, this is your ballistic tip to give it good aerodynamics, and it just comes off the moment this shell hits something. So this is just aerodynamics. That comes off, and then we can see the actual armor penetrator here in the top of the shell. That is a cap just like this that is hardened steel, and this is what allows the shell to punch through armor without deforming. Underneath this, we have the actual body of the shell. So this is going to be steel mass with an explosive charge inside it. This is a mock-up of the actual void, the chamber inside that holds the explosive charge. So it's about a 35, maybe 40-pound detonating charge in this 2,700-pound armor-piercing projectile. So the idea is this will punch through the armor of a ship, get into the inside, and then this much of it explodes with, 2,500 pounds of steel shrapnel flying around to do its level best to destroy everything inside that enemy ship. At the very bottom of this, the actual shell body, there is a base detonating fuse that screws in. This is essentially the naval bombardment version of a primer, a centerfire primer. This has a time delay of like 0.13 seconds on it, which is, in theory, enough time for this shell at its nominal muzzle velocity to travel about 80 feet. The idea is, well, the New Jersey here is a little over 100 feet wide, so no matter where it enters a ship, it will detonate while it's still inside the ship. And of course, once it starts going through armor and such, it will slow down. So 80 feet, about what, a sixth, a seventh of a second before it detonates. That should put it nicely inside the guts of the enemy ship when it detonates.
The 2 decks immediately below are the upper and lower projectile handling platforms. Each platform consists of 2 concentric sections.
All right, now we have to talk about boring old logistics again, because so much of this process is based on logistics and handling, and how like every component in a 16-inch gun system is so massive, it requires all sorts of special procedures and considerations compared to something like a paltry 5-inch gun, where a crewman can just pick up the shell and move it to where it needs to be. Well, okay, this thing weighs 2,000 pounds, and it's the light one. How do you move these around? Well, the guns, you need to have ammo storage. The New Jersey carried about 300 rounds per gun. So in this turret, somewhere, we have to have about 900 rounds accessible, available to use. So they kind of go everywhere around the turret. Specifically, we have two primary areas of ammunition storage. We have fixed ammo storage, which is over here. That's on the outside of the turret. That's connected to the hull. We have rotating projectile storage here on the inside. You can see the cutouts in the floor here. This middle section that I'm standing on now actually is connected to the turret. So when the turret rotates, this bit moves with it. The inner rotating projectile storage, this stuff, is actually on its own independent rotating track that allows these shells to be moved into position near the ammo elevators. Special elevator to get the shells from here up a couple more stories to where the guns actually are. There is so much that we could go into about all the nuances of how this system works. You should definitely check out the USS New Jersey's own YouTube channel. They do a ton of content. Ryan Szymanski, the curator here, does a great job of explaining, for those of you who want to know all the details about a ship like this or a gun system like this, he does a great job of explaining how it works. Little things like, when these shells are in storage, well, you need to make sure that they don't tip over, because that'll crush a guy, and how do you lift them back up? And so each shell is basically bicycle chained into position here in its stowage position, and they'll have two sets, like two layers of shells here. So these are up against the outer wall. There would be another shell here that's got its connecting locking chain there. You have a similar situation on the inside, but that's there. And then to actually move the shells around, because remember, you have to load them onto the ship somehow. You may have to unload them off of the ship. In fact, interesting fact, when the ship went into the port of New York, there's docking facilities there, but it wasn't a military base. And for security reasons, to ensure that all the ammo didn't explode in port, like in Halifax in World War I, they had to actually unload all of these projectiles before they went into the port of New York. So how do you do all that? Well, there are a series of powered rotating capstans on this central ring, and two crewmen would be responsible for moving a shell. One of them takes up the slack on the rope on the capstan. There's a second man whose job is to hold on to the top of the shell to make sure it doesn't tip. They'll unchain it, and they'll use a rope and pulley system to haul the shell out onto this rotating segment, where they can then rotate it back to a hatch to lower it down below the bottom of the turret barbette, where it can then be shifted outside the armored turret and then hoisted all the way back up out the deck of the ship. So that's how ammo actually came into the ship. There was no port in the armored turret structure to load projectiles in. They actually came in outside of the turret, went all the way down to the bottom of the ship, and then back up inside the armored cylinder of the turret. So the next step, of course, is we have to get the shells from the storage here up several more stories to the guns. How do you do that? Well, you have a shell hoist. Each of the turrets has 3 of these hoists. Each hoist is directly associated with one of the gun barrels. So they're located on this central ring in the magazine, in the projectile storage area, which is fixed to the turret. So this is always directly related to the gun barrel above it. You use this capstan system again to hoist a projectile into the lifter, and it can be set up. You can see there's a brass ring here for a rope to pulley around. Another one right here. This can be set up to pull a shell either from the fixed projectile storage out there or the rotating storage in there, like so. And then I have a control here on the hoist that allows me to lift the shell up to the next level. So this hoist can actually hold up to 5 shells at a time. Once that one's up far enough, we can slide another shell in here and get it moving as well. So there is no, like, this is the closest that projectiles are stored to the turret. There's no small supply of ready ammunition up in the turret. If you knew action was incoming and you're going to be firing the guns, the best thing you can do to prepare in advance is get 5 shells fully stacked up in this elevator so that at least those first 5 are ready as quickly as possible. So you might be wondering, how does one actually move a turret as big as the behemoth of the 3-gun 16-inch turret on the New Jersey? Well, the answer is a couple of really big motors. So if you come from projectile storage, you then climb up a ladder to that down there, which is the 2nd level of projectile storage, and then up another ladder, you will find yourself in this series of compartments, which is too small for me to use my regular camera in. That is the 80 horsepower electric motor that is used for elevating and depressing the guns, and this is the 300 horsepower electric motor that is used to rotate the turret. This is, of the 1,000 electric motors across the whole of the New Jersey, this is the biggest one. Well, this and its 2 sisters in the other turrets. So that is what's actually used to move the turret. Now, if we go up through this next hatch, we will actually be in the gun pit. And that, way up there, is Ryan Szymanski, curator of the USS New Jersey Museum. And that is the breech of a 16-inch Mark VII naval gun. So I wanted to put this in some perspective for you guys. You can see the shell way up there. That's where it actually pops out of the hoist mechanism. I don't know if you can see the powder. There's a big door on this side where the powder comes out, and then this whole structure in front of you is the loading tray. So the gun right now is elevated at a 20-degree angle. That's sort of the standard transit angle for the gun. It can be mechanically locked into this position, which it is now, to take weight and strain off of the elevation system. In actual combat, we're in the number 2 turret right now. That can elevate from 0 degrees flat up to plus 45, which is why there's this huge empty void below me, so that this whole recoil mechanism can elevate up like that. The numbers 1 and 3 turrets can actually depress to -2 degrees, but here in number 2, we've got another turret right in front of us, so it can't depress. At any rate, we have an interrupted thread rotating breech block back here, which unfortunately I can't just open for you because this is a just ginormous piece of machinery. When you fire, this entire assembly is going to recoil back up to 42 inches, which essentially comes back to this landing in front of me. If I were here when the gun fired, I would be absolutely squished into pastrami. You have 2 cylinders up top that are the counter recoiling cylinders, so those are what push the whole barrel assembly back into position after it's fired. The recoil dampening assembly is actually located underneath here, where I can't really get the camera down to show you. Breech block rotates open. Well, let's take a closer look. Let me show you how this loading assembly works. If I don't kill myself getting up out of this pit. All right.
In most smaller and newer guns, loading can be accomplished at any angle of elevation. But these big 16-inch guns must be brought to 5 degrees elevation. When the gun is in loading position, the gun captain opens the breech. Then the cradle and spanning tray can be tipped by a hydraulic cylinder to align with the bore of the gun. When the spanning tray is in position, the rammer operator rams the projectile into the gun. The rammer is retracted, and the gun is ready for the powder bags. Now the powder trunk door is opened, and 3 powder bags are rolled into the tray. Then the powder car moves down, and 3 more bags are rolled into the tray. All 6 bags are now rammed slowly into the gun. That's right, 6 bags, each one about 18 inches long and 18 inches in diameter. The rammer is retracted. Now the cradle operator raises the cradle and turns the ready switch to ready. The gun automatically goes back to firing position, and the firing circuit can be completed.
While the projectile and the powder are being loaded, there's actually a man whose position is down here in the gun pit. He's the primer man, and he is actually going to pull the spent primer out of the breech block down there and replace it with a new one. Remember, there's no brass casing on this. This is an obturating breech block by itself, so there has to be some priming mechanism to go into it. And the case, I don't know if they designed the case from scratch or if they converted it, but it kind of looks like a converted 3040 Krag brass cartridge case with a primer and a little charge of black powder in it. The primer man is going to set that in the breech of the gun, and then he is going to retreat into that corner down there where he is behind the maximum travel of the breech. In fact, you can see that red line painted on the wall. That is how far that breech block is going to come back upon firing. So if you're standing on that little pedestal where I was just a minute ago, you will be dead if the gun fires. You instead want to be back there, and you have enough space to get into a safe location. And by the way, that right down there is the hatch that we came up to get into here. So this is an example of a fired primer from the 16-inch main gun. Again, basically brass cartridge case. It always comes back to just a basic brass cartridge case. The primer in here can be either percussion or electric. So physical hammer can fire this gun, or an electrical signal can fire it. And we've got a detonating charge in here that will detonate the black powder on the back of each bag of powder. I don't think I mentioned that. Each bag of powder actually has a quilted section of black powder on the back end as an initial charge. That powder detonating sets off the main powder, which is in grains this big. This is a 3D printed mock-up, but that's what the individual grains of 16-inch gun powder are like. These are set off by the black powder charge, and then each of the 6 bags of powder in sequence has the same buildup. So the first bag of powder flakes here will deflagrate. That will set off the initial bursting charge of black powder in the second bag, then the main charge in the second bag, and so on, all the way through all 6 bags, propelling that 2,700-pound projectile out the muzzle at approximately 2,500 feet per second, the same as a typical rifle bullet. All right, so if we come up out of the gun pit, we emerge into the gun house. So I just came out of this door. That door goes in to access the powder elevator in case it needs to be accessed. We have a door over here for the right-hand gun, and then everything comes back to this central position, which is where the gun commander is going to work. So normally this whole thing is operated under control of the information system, the computers, the directors, back in the heart of the ship. However, it is possible to run each turret individually from what they would call local control. So here we have the big brass director, or big brass controller. Right now it is set to director, which means as soon as the gun is loaded, it's going to elevate to whatever elevation the fire control computer back in fore plot or aft plot is telling it. Or we can switch over to local control here. Now, under local control, we have a little miniature version of the electromechanical fire control computer that's in the plot room. So this is going to get a bunch of inputs for where is the ship, how fast is the ship going, how fast is the target going, what direction is the target traveling in. We can set our shell velocity. This doesn't use as much data as the main fire control computer, but it uses a bunch, and it creates a mechanical firing solution. Now you might wonder, how do we know anything about the enemy ship? Well, we have a periscope right here that looks out, that, oh my camera's not really going to focus on. But the gun commander can use that to actually look out of the turret and get an azimuth. And then behind us, this whole giant thing over here is an optical rangefinder. So one end of this is fixed. The other end of it can pivot in and out. We have controllers to operate this who sit back here in the back end of the turret. They can provide a range and azimuth to target. This is a little miniature version of the switch bank that will also have duplicated in the plotting rooms. This allows us to set what information is coming from what source to give the fire control computer all of its information. And then there is a trigger in here somewhere. What I would do, if I'm gonna fire this under local control, first I'm gonna warn the crew in here that we are about to fire, and then I'm gonna hit the fire button. Notice here, by the way, we have ready indication. Gun 2 is ready to fire. Plot is ready. None of this other stuff is online because, well, the ship's not really online right now. All right, that pretty much covers the local control, which is not what you actually want to be using in a 16-inch gun turret. Like if the situation is such that you have to aim and fire this thing manually from inside the turret, stuff has gone seriously sideways. This is supposed to be operated from the plot room. So let's head in there and let me show you the real computer that they use to generate a firing solution that can potentially make a hit on a moving enemy target from a moving USS New Jersey at 23 land miles, 20 nautical miles of range. All right, we are in the Mark 38 Director. This is, there are three of these Directors to work specifically with the main guns. This is Spot 1, and it is the highest thing on the ship. If you see, basically the tall mast on the superstructure of an Iowa-class battleship, the whole purpose of having that really tall mast is to have this room up at the top of it. We have an optical rangefinder right here. To put this in perspective, that's the water way down there. That's 14 stories down. We are up in that little room right there. And the two big beams coming off the side are the arms of the optical rangefinder. It's really high up here. And the idea is an observer somewhere lower in the ship is going to be, or the radar system, is going to be looking for enemy targets. They're going to call up here and say, bearing 165, enemy ship spotted. We are then going to rotate this rangefinder towards bearing 165. We're going to use the optical rangefinder to spot the target, determine the exact range. Because this is a rotating structure, we can also use this to determine the exact azimuth to the target. We can observe the target through the rangefinder, get an estimate of target speed and bearing, what direction the enemy target's going. And then all of that information goes back down to the plot room where it's fed into the mechanical fire control computer to generate a firing solution. Now, there are a lot of redundancies in these ships. You can actually fire the main guns from up here. This is kind of surreal, we are 15 stories above the water at this point in this little tiny room that has no windows aside from a periscope. So I know we're up here at the top of a spindly little mast, and I might have some height worries if I could actually see out, but I can't. And in combat, there'd be three guys sitting in here with me and probably one or two more back with the camera there on duty. Like there's a lot of men in this little tiny box way up top of the ship. Oh, all right, let's head down to the fire control computer where they actually use the data that comes out of this room. So this is main battery forward fire control. This is the brains behind those 16-inch gun turrets. Those turrets have a range of out to approximately 42,000 yards. That's 20 nautical miles, or about 23 land miles. You can't see that far with the naked eye. You can't just hip fire, take a wild guess at where an enemy ship's going to be when your shell actually gets there. The flight time for a shell from these 16-inch main guns at that sort of extreme range is in excess of a minute long. You have to plan where the enemy ship's going to be and fire at that point, not where the ship is now. So how do you do that in 1943 when the USS New Jersey is commissioned? Well, you do that with a Mark 8 Rangekeeper. This is an electromechanical computer that calculates a firing solution. It has like 19 different inputs. You're going to tell it the direction of the target vessel, the speed of the target vessel, the direction and speed of your own vessel, the wind direction, because you think there's windage effects on an 800-yard rifle shot? Try an 8,000 or a 28,000 or a 38,000-yard battleship gunshot. Like, wind is a major thing. They have removed one of the top covers, replaced it with Lexan, so we can see this actually operating. This is literally computing a firing solution right now because the computer has been turned on and it's been given a fire control solution that involves a moving target and a moving ship. So it's constantly having to update as the bearing to the target changes. So you've got all of your inputs here by individual hand crank, and then a whole slew of actual physical gears and cogs inside this machine will do the math to calculate a firing solution. Now, behind me here, we have a whole bunch, it's massive rack of switches. This allows us to determine what information comes in and what information goes out of this computer system. This thing can operate essentially any of the guns on this ship, not just the 16-inch main gun batteries, but it could also be used to direct the 5-inch gun turrets if the ship had taken damage and you needed, the secondary battery plot room, which is essentially a duplicate of this, was out of action. Well, we can direct the smaller guns from here as well. We can choose to direct 1 or 2 or all 3 of the main gun turrets from here. There's an aft plot room. You can actually have guns firing at different targets simultaneously, and they can use inputs for things like target azimuth, target speed from various things. Perhaps we have a lock on a target from an optical rangefinder. We want to use the optical rangefinder's ranging information. We use these switches to tell it, okay, we want to use the optical rangefinder in turret 2. For some reason, that's the one that we can actually get good data from. We're going to use that to input data into the computer, and then we're going to output to turret 1 that's still firing, something like that. Or radar systems. The New Jersey did have early radar systems in World War II for surface engagements, and of course, later in its career, it would have more and more and better, up to fairly modern radar systems. Those are all wired into this system as well. In fact, it's interesting that the New Jersey served all the way until 1991. Later in its deployments, they looked at replacing this 1943 literal box of gears with a modern digital computer and realized it wouldn't actually do the job any better. And this thing still works after 50 years of service. Keep using it, why not? So this was the fire control computer for the entirety of New Jersey's service life, which is really awesome. Anyway, you input all your data, you get a firing solution, you transmit it out to whatever guns you want to use. So remember, we were back in the turret. We have that selector set to director mode. That means it's going to take data from one of these fire control directors. It's the crew in here that chooses what data, what gun they're sending their data to. Now, to actually fire, we go to a separate system. This guy, located right next to the computer that is there, this is the Mark 41 Stable Vertical. And this is essentially tracking point for a battleship, basically. There's a big gyroscope in here, and the purpose of this thing is to make sure that when you fire, you're actually firing from a level position. If you think about it, that computer can do all of its calculations, but it's assuming that the firing position is flat and level in all 3 axes. Well, a battleship's sitting on the ocean. It's going to be moving at all times, and maybe seas are particularly rough and the ship's rolling quite a lot. Well, calculate your fire solution all you want. If the ship rolls a little bit, all of a sudden, like, that firing solution's no good. You want to wait until the ship is actually at a level position before you fire. That's what this guy does. So the gyroscope in here controls one of 2 firing circuits. One of them is controlled by a physical trigger that I pull right in there. Literally, it's a pistol grip trigger in the fire control center of the middle of the battleship. It's still a trigger finger that fires the main guns. When I'm ready to fire, the first thing I actually do is warn the crew with this trigger. 3 pulls on that says we're about to fire. I then go to the pineapple. That's the one with the knobs on the grip, so it's easily recognizable even in the dark. And I'm going to pull this trigger and just hold it. Now the tracking point system comes in. When the gyroscope determines that the ship has actually come to a level position, it will automatically close the circuit and fire the guns. So, you know, if the ship's not really moving, that could very well be an effectively instantaneous trigger. But if we're in heavy seas and rolling, this may take a second or 2 or 5. The fire control system is continuing to update the solution as the target moves, and as soon as the ship's actually level, the gun fires. Now, this third trigger is your backup. If you need to fire right now, like say we are at effectively battleship point blank range and we don't care about a little bit of roll, you can pull this trigger and it will fire the guns immediately, bypassing the gyro. But that is how the guns are actually intended to be fired. Now, it's worth pointing out there's the Iowa-class battleships are, if they're built around any one concept, it's redundancy. Every system has backup systems, and there are actually something like 46 different places in the ship from which you can fire the main guns. Maybe all of them, maybe one of them at a time, all the way down to the most emergency basic level. You can actually hook a lanyard up to the primer on the back of the individual gun, and that primer man can yank a rope and fire the gun from down in the gun pit like that. But if it's come to that, lots of things have gone really wrong. This is the primary fire system. This computer, by the way, is of course electrically powered, like all computers, right? Well, what do you do if for some reason the power to the computer is cut? You still need to be able to fire the guns. You need to do it accurately. That's what this guy is for. This actually has a backup power system that is essentially a sailor on a bicycle. It's this hand crank. You can hear that. As long as I'm turning this crank, this is actually powering the computer, and it will continue to put out a valid fire solution as long as I'm manually powering it here. So that's the backup. We don't really have hand crank backups on computers anymore, but this works for the New Jersey. So these guns have been fired a lot through the course of New Jersey's service history. In World War II, between shore bombardment and anti-ship engagements, the New Jersey fired something like 1,000 rounds through its guns in total. It then is decommissioned in 1948 and then recommissioned for the Korean War. And in the Korean War, it actually fires more ammunition through these main guns than it did during World War II. Now, the service life of one of these barrels is only about 300 rounds. Like, actually, to me at least, surprisingly low, but there's a lot of heat and pressure. That's a huge gun. Now, they don't rebarrel the guns once they've fired 300 rounds because you want to make sure that if the ship has to deploy to war, it needs to be able to effectively, accurately, safely fire all of the ammunition that is on board, which is about 100 rounds, a little over 100 rounds per gun. So when the barrels get to the point that they've been fired about 200 rounds each, that's when the Navy looks at rebarreling them. And this happened in 1954. All 9 of the New Jersey's gun barrels were removed and replaced. Now, they don't scrap the old barrels. What they actually do is bore them out and reline them with new rifling sections to replace the worn rifling. Unless there's a crack in a barrel or something, a defect that develops. So the guns are rebarreled in 1954. Now, the New Jersey goes back into service for the Vietnam War, and in fact, during the Vietnam War, she fires even more ammunition than she did between World War II and Korea combined. These are, of course, all shore bombardment missions. The North Koreans don't have a navy to speak of, not one that's going to threaten a battleship, an Iowa-class battleship like this. Combat missions during the Vietnam War included shore bombardment in support of troops, included star shells for illumination, and really interestingly included using some of those high-capacity explosive rounds actually to fire a single round into the jungle to create like a 200-meter in diameter sorry about that, to create like a 200-meter in diameter helicopter landing zone in what had previously been jungle, because a 16-inch high explosive shell will do that very effectively. So ship then also deployed to Lebanon in the 1980s, fired the guns again. By that point, in fact, during the Vietnam War, they developed some powder additives that essentially would coat the inside of the barrel and the chamber with like a Teflon type material when fired, which prevented a lot of the erosion to the rifling and to the inside of the chamber, and extended the lifespan of the barrels essentially beyond the lifespan of the ship itself. So they were all the guns were rebarreled in 1954. Even though they ended up firing more rounds after 54 than before, they never had to be rebarreled again. And the guns here are still that second set of guns that were installed in 1954. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. This was really fascinating to me to get a chance to explore all the way up and down the entire system that is the 16-inch guns on the Iowa-class battleships like the New Jersey. I'd like to give a big thanks to World of Warships for making this possible. Of course, if you want to take command of the New Jersey yourself,
she will be released and added to the game later this year.
Or if you want to come set foot on the real-life New Jersey here where we are, you can come down.
Muster restricted men and extra duty men with a duty master at arms outside the duty master at arms office.
Or if you want to come set foot on the real USS New Jersey, right here, she is a museum ship today, berthed outside of Camden, New Jersey, open to the public. You can come take a look in those turrets for yourself. Definitely, if you're in the area, don't miss out. This is one of the coolest museum ships out there. And even if you can't make it here, you can check out their YouTube channel where they have a plethora of videos about all sorts of interesting, nerdy details about the ship itself. And if you like this channel, you'll definitely like theirs. So I've linked to them in the description text below. You can check out their address, come visit yourself, or take command of the New Jersey yourself in World of Warships. Thanks for watching.